Hi, my name is Matthew Cole. I'm a producer with NBC News, and I'm going to do something slightly different than what you guys have seen throughout the course of the day, which is obviously I don't have very much technical knowledge at all, but I have a story for you. And it just so happens to coincide with technical stuff. I pitched this, OPSEC failure of spies, before Edward Snowden made any of his leaks. And so it only became more timely in that it's about metadata. And just to give you a little bit of background, I cover national security and intelligence and worked on what will be called the Italian job, which was how it was colloquially known inside the agency, but it was a extraordinary rendition in 2003. And I worked on the story I did a piece for GQ and then sold a book to Simon & Schuster, and the book was eventually killed. And so what I ended up with was about 5 or 6 years worth of reporting, some of which has been reported, but a lot of which has never seen any kind of public forum. So this will be the first for it. And just as a small note, for most of the slides that you're going to see here, they are open source. They were pulled off the internet in part because the Italian government and prosecutor who was involved in this did a marvelous thing of trying to shine as much sunlight as he could on the CIA. So just to give you a little bit of background. So 2003, obviously, is post 9/11. CIA is dashing madly all around the world to try to find people who they believed were connected to Al-Qaeda, terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. And they came up with a sort of a new spin on an old concept, which was extraordinary rendition. Now, historically, extraordinary rendition was taking someone who they believed was in a third country, let's say Croatia, who was an Egyptian and was wanted in Egypt for terrorism, and they would act as something like a Federal Express. They would pick up a package and they would deliver a package, and if that package was later tortured, that's how it goes. And after 9/11, they wanted to up their game. And they had a different idea, which was we didn't need a charge anymore, and we didn't necessarily have to get help from the locals. We want to be able to grab people if we think they're vital. So 2002, 2003, Abu Omar, an Egyptian cleric living in Milan, had permanent Italian residency, was a spiritual guide to some young jihadists. The CIA believed that he had involvement in shipping young men to Iraq. This is before the war, but nonetheless was part of a underground railroad that would send people to Al-Qaeda to fight in Iraq when the war began. So the CIA decided they were going to take him. This picture is an actual surveillance picture that Italian counterterrorism forces took slyly, covertly, actually on the spot where he was grabbed a month later. So this photo is about 50 feet from where he was grabbed a month later, and this picture was found on in the possession of, or in the house of, one of the CIA officers who was later, whose home was raided, although he was not grabbed. So they grab him on February 2003, take him from Milan, they fly him to Germany, they transit him at a US Air Force base, and then they send him to Egypt, where he goes into interrogation. Now, they had a long list of questions for him. Where's Osama bin Laden? When's the next attack? What do you know? What do you know? What do you know? Unfortunately, he didn't know very much, but they gave him a very rough treatment over a period of time. He was in an Egyptian cell for about 14 months. And Italian prosecutors and police had only one small lead, which was that on the day that he was taken, a young woman, a mother of two with her 2 kids and a loaf of bread, was walking down the street, and they happened to see a guy who she thought might be the local imam being shoved into a van, and the van speeding off. So the police had a time of day and a location, which helps. So the prosecutor asked the investigators to do a cell phone tower dump and find all of the cell phone towers in the 2 or 3 block radius of the kidnapping, between a 4-hour block, and give him all the data. Now, as it was, that process, because of some mistakes, took some time. Meanwhile, in his 14 months, after 14 months, because there was no charge, the Egyptians freed him. And one of the first things he did was he called his wife, who was back in their apartment in Milan, and that phone call was being tapped by the Italian authorities. They hear the phone call, they get a transcript, and in it, Abu Omar says, "I was kidnapped, they were Western." The Italians knew that it was Americans, they suspected that it was the Americans, but they didn't have anything to look at. At around the time that Abu Omar makes that fateful call to his wife, the investigators come back with data. And that data was analyst's notebook, which gave them everything that they could want to know about metadata and phones being used in the spot and around. After about a month and a half of investigation, they started to find something really interesting. So what we see here is a closed-off network of roughly 18 individuals using about 30 phones that, in essence, only were used to talk to each other. So they were a completely quarantined network. Now, if you are a prosecutor looking and sifting through metadata, this here sticks out a lot, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. Now, the term for the people who are on the street that the CIA was employing, called snapshots. They do surveillance all around the world. They try to blend in and look like tourists or just locals. They have, in a sense, they have the low end of the job, but it's quite important because they are the ones who are exposed physically. They come into the country under aliases, sometimes under a real name, and they go about doing their business to try to grab people or figure out if someone's being followed. So when the Italian prosecutors were looking at the network, they could see that there was some kind of conspiracy going on. It was a good circumstantial case that they could start to build. But there was more. Once they had the phone numbers and could identify the network that was being used, they focused on all of those phones and how long they were being used and every call they made while they were turned on in Italy. What were they able to do? Minute by minute, roughly, they were able to get a map of everywhere they had moved. So this image is actually the cell phone use on the day of the kidnapping, at the time of the kidnapping. And if you start here at the top, it's hard to see, this pointer's not great, but at the top, at the beginning of the yellow line, is Abu Omar's house. And they had a team that was sitting outside waiting because they knew every day at roughly at noon he went to the mosque to pray. So they waited for him, and they walked and followed him, and they had another team come and walk and follow him. And that yellow line represents all of the calls that were being made on that day at the moment they took him, and it stops. It stops right where that picture of the van is, because that's where they grabbed him and then drove back in the opposite direction to head out of town. So one of the reasons why I pitched this talk was because in the current debate about metadata, one of the things that we're hearing, and we heard it today from General Alexander, is that the content of the calls is not being collected, and therefore there isn't much of a privacy issue. And one of the things that we learned from the Milan case, and the CIA is certainly continuing to learn, is that in many ways metadata is far more telling than the conversation you're having. So it really doesn't matter that they're not capturing what it is that you're saying to mom. It's that when you make that call and the other phone receives it, through analysis, network analysis, data visualization, and sifting through the metadata, they can tell you more about your life and understand the patterns of your life than you think you end. You know, realize we, in some ways, we're kind of like ants. We have patterns physically that repeat over and over and over again. And our cell phones give that data away, and it's giving it away to some cost. So if you were here for the keynote address this morning, you saw that General Alexander showed a quick box of what it looks like when the metadata of a phone is actually tracked. Phone number, another phone number, duration of the time. This is similar. These names that you see here are actually aliases and fake names, dummy names, but the phones are correct. And then you have the number of times they made a call. You had the first time they were used and the last time they were used, all within, generally, what they discovered quickly was that, you know, for about 35 phones, they all started about 2 months before the operation, and they all ended 2 days after the operation. So again, they're building a case through the metadata and sifting through, figuring out who was whom and how they were behaving. This is just a quick example of the type of analysis and network analysis that they're looking at. You have on each side 2 different phones, 2 different SIM cards represented by a cell phone number, and all the different other phones that they call to get a sense of what they're doing. This is just a close-up to give you an idea of what it looks like. So, once they were able to figure out that they clearly had a criminal case, a criminal conspiracy, there was a group of people, they suspected Americans, they were obviously up to no good, and they certainly had something to do with the disappearance of this imam, they started to drill in and started to look at, find out more about what they could get from the metadata. And once they were able to identify the phones, they started to do something really clever. They said, well, let's see what they do over the course of the day. What does the day look like for them? And they would watch them. Now again, this is 14 months later, but sifting through the data, they would watch them. And they would watch them move and do surveillance and move around the area where Abu Omar was and track him. And then they would see that at the end of the day, like normal people, they would go and have dinner, and then they would go stay in their hotel. And when they went in their hotel, they did not take the batteries out of their cell phones. So what happened? Those phones continued to ping. And so for 8 hours or 10 hours, those phones sat in one location without moving, without doing anything. And they drilled in and they got another cell phone tower dump, and they found where the phones would rest at night. They looked around and they figured out which hotel was within 300 feet. They went to the hotel, they said, you know, can we see a list of all the Americans who have stayed here? And they started to figure out who was who. And as they did, they really could build out, again, more and more about what they did while they were there. So Raymond Harbaugh, it's not his real name, it's an alias, but Raymond Harbaugh was the leader of the surveillance team, the snapshots, if you will. Older gentleman, very well versed in traveling around Europe, blending in and doing surveillance for the CIA. And what you can see in this slide is that at his disposal, he's using at least 2 phones with 3 chips, okay, among other things. They've got his passport, they were able to get his credit card, all the hotels that he stayed at, including the dates, and then the various phones that he was in contact with. Now, I mentioned that Harbaugh was not his real name. Generally, when you want to do a covert operation, one of the things you do is you try to be covert, right? You go, they send you out to a foreign country, and you've got a fake passport, and you've got a credit card in that name, and you've got, as you'll see in a second, a AAA motor card, and all sorts of other things, all in that identity. For some reason, they sent poor George Purvis to Milan with his real name. Now, George Purvis was also a very veteran guy. He'd been in the CIA for about 20 years, doing almost entirely this kind of work in counterterrorism. Surveillance, the stuff that you're supposed to be a real spooky spy, James Bond kind of thing. Well, George Purvis didn't get the memo. When he landed in Milan and he registered himself into his hotel, let me step back for a second. We know about George Purvis because of his cell phone, so I'm skipping ahead to say that the metadata gave away who he was, his phone, et cetera, et cetera. So now they're looking into what he did. When he registered at the hotel, he registered under his name, he gave his emails, his wife's email address, he gave his home address, he was very helpful, he gave his phone number, everything you might ever need to find George Purvis. Now, as a quick aside, if any of you are compelled to go find George Purvis in Northern Virginia, I do not recommend knocking on his door. He does not take to it very well. He's a little sensitive about having been exposed. Now, Purvis and Harbaugh were 2 important links because, as I said before, this was a closed network. And the CIA did think about this. They sent out 20 people to do something that was covert, and the idea was that there had to be a firewall. They could not be in communication with any of the CIA employees in the country. That was a simple tradecraft rule. And George Purvis and Raymond Harbaugh, though, were the 2 interfaces. Those 2 and those 2 only, because they were the most senior, were to be contacting the station and other parts of the CIA in Italy that needed help. They needed additional phones, they needed strategic advice on what to do when Abu Omar didn't show up one day. This was supposed to be a very quick job. Abu Omar turned out to be not as predictable as they had hoped, and so they spent weeks just surveilling and surveilling and surveilling them. So Purvis and Raymond Harbaugh acted as this filter, and we'll get there for a second. Now, I'm going to skip ahead just slightly. One of the things that I discovered in this over the course of it was that later the CIA could see that they had made mistakes, and we'll get to that in a second, but they did their own internal investigation. And when they did their own internal investigation, they looked at this. They said, Jesus, the snapshots really didn't do a very good job. Let's go ask them what happened. So they went down to the bowels of the agency to find the snapshots and say what went wrong. And they asked one particular guy who was on this job, said, why did you think that when you were walking around with your cell phone, even though you weren't using it, that it wasn't leaving an electronic handshake with the towers as you went around? And this covert James Bond guy said, well, you know, we were told that if we just held our cell phone in a bag of potato chips, it was going to be clean. Now, it's pretty funny. Of course, this is what he really meant, was that it was supposed to be a Faraday cage, and he didn't realize that your bag of Doritos just isn't quite strong enough to keep your phone from emitting its signal. But that was the kind of the lack of understanding that they had in 2003 when they were trying to run some of the most secretive operations that they had done in 30 years. This is another example. This is Monica Courtney Adler. Of course, that's not her name. Now, one of the things that the Italian prosecutor had a problem with is he could find you this, okay? Using Analyst's notebook, he could determine everything about what they did when they were in Italy. But they were an alias, so it was impossible to know who they were. Luckily, on this side of the ocean, I had access to LexisNexis and Accurant. And with a handy trail of phone calls that they left behind, I was able to determine of the 20, probably about 8 of their real identities. Some of whom I've contacted, none of whom were happy to see me. Monica Courtney Adler, for instance, was a friend of someone who was in the agency, and as it happens, she took as her fake name her friend's last name. That sucks. There's Monica Courtney Adler. These are the photographs of the pictures that they gave to, I think this was for her car rental, but you know, you had to give a photo ID when they came in, and the Italians grabbed them. That's a pretty good shot. She's not working in Europe anymore. Another one. One of the things they found also, in addition to the passport numbers, in the credit card numbers, they found them serialized. So there were too many numbers sequenced that were the same, you know, with the last 3 digits different. Again, the Italians had one hell of a circumstantial case. This guy, he's one of my favorites. I'm not going to tell you his real name, but I will tell you that he used to work at the FBI, and 20 years ago was a public affairs officer for the FBI, now runs a bed and breakfast. Nice guy. Now, going back to Purvis and Harbaugh, this is the crux of the case. Here we have a phone, one IMI, one serial number for itself, 2 different SIM cards that it's using, 2 different numbers. What was the problem? The problem was one of those SIMs, the one that's registered to Barbara Sudeth, by the way, is also a real CIA officer, or was, and the other was a SIM card that was registered to the station. This phone was passed over to the team that was doing the surveillance. And what the station didn't know was that Harbaugh used that phone to make a call to the station with a clean chip but a dirty phone, a phone that had been previously cycled into the operational group. And he made a call so that when the station saw the phone ringing, they had the right number. It was the one number that they were to respond to. It was a clean SIM card. But the phone was a phone that was being used to talk to everyone else in the group. And that was, from the investigative standpoint, for the prosecutor, what they needed to bring charges against the Americans. Another one. So the station chief, they decide they now have enough to pull his records. So they do. What do they find? For 2 weeks, shortly after Abu Omar is grabbed, his cell phone ends up in Egypt, where he's there making calls. That's Robert Lady. It's the only picture that's known or that has been published. To the next of him on the, what is your right, is one of his assets, who was an Italian police officer who actually is the fellow who stopped Abu Omar on the street and was seen by the young mother with the 2 kids and the loaf of bread. This is just pulled off the internet, but he's in fact still wanted, and if you've followed at all, about a week and a half ago, Mr. Lady ended back up in the news because he was detained temporarily in Panama, transiting through. Apparently he's back in the United States safely, but if you wanted to have any sense that this wasn't just some old story from 2003 of sloppy tradecraft, it has real implications for a lot of people who are involved who cannot travel outside of the United States, and who, rightly or wrongly, there are a lot of people who would like to see thrown in prison, especially since they've all been convicted in absentia of kidnapping. So I would have left you with one other thing. As they say about a story, there's a bit of a reveal, which is that all of this came out of Analyst's Notebook, which, you know, I don't know how many of you have seen it before, but it's an off-the-shelf at $15,000, or it was back then $15,000 program doing data visualization and network analysis. So after 9/11, the CIA looked around to all its partners around the world and said, what can we do to help? And they looked at the Italian counterterrorism people and they said, you know, you guys need something that helps you guys figure out phones and how terrorists are using phones. So Bob Lady handed over Analyst's Notebook to the Italian investigators who were in Milan, who were ordered then to do the investigation into them. Just a bit of irony. Again, it would be an old story, except that 2007, 2008, Hezbollah rolls up a Israeli intelligence network operating in Lebanon. Israelis come to the Americans and they say, hey, you guys got a problem. We were rolled up through metadata. Our phones were being monitored. How we were using our phones were being picked out. We figured it out. Americans said, no way, just can't be. Can't be that Hezbollah has access to cellular data and the telecoms in Lebanon. So in about 2009, 2010, they did a study, a counterintelligence study. And they said, yeah, you know what, we're exposed. If we keep using our phones this way, we're gonna get rolled up. Summer 2011, Nasrallah, head of the leader of Hezbollah, goes on television to announce that they've captured 2 American spies, 2 Hezbollah officials who had been spying for the Americans. Now, they had done some plain old human intelligence and tricked the Americans. They ran 2 double agents at them, and that's going to happen. But they were able to roll up their entire network in about 90% of the CIA's human asset network in Lebanon was rolled up in November 2011. How? Metadata. They looked at, in a stream of information, they looked at phones that did things that were anomalies. 2 phones that only spoke to each other once a month for 30 seconds, i.e. our meeting time. 2 phones that spoke to each other once a week for 2 minutes. And they started looking at cell phone tower dumps to see where they were. Put people on them, followed, watched. Next thing you know, they had rolled up everyone that the Americans had spying for them and their officers. So this is a screen grab from Hezbollah television. It's a Hezbollah-run television station in Lebanon. And if you were Dan McFeely, and there is a Dan McFeely, it's a bad day. Your name. Or if this was you sitting at a cafe meeting with an asset and you ended up with your face, I didn't black that out. The Hezbollah was nice enough to black that out before they gave it to the television network there. You wouldn't be having a good day. So that's the end. I just wanted to tell a story and give you a sense that despite the fact that the CIA and the US government intelligence agencies have an enormous amount of money, they too have been cut by the metadata problem that we're dealing with now on the American domestic privacy side. So anyway, please remember to swipe, and thank you all for coming.